We're going to be talking today about the Achaemenid Persians and about the art created under the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The primary thing that we're really going to be looking at here is a site specifically called Persepolis. We're going to be talking about Persepolis, a little bit about its history, and specifically looking at some of the architectural forms there and the sculpture and forms of decoration that we see, which date to this early Persian culture. So we're really primarily, when we talk about this site, going to be looking at and discussing some examples that date back roughly to about the 6th century BCE. In the 6th century, the Persian forces were really probably one of the most dominant military forces on the planet. The Persians managed to capture huge swaths of land throughout the known world at the time. They managed to push into Egypt. They controlled parts of Egypt. They controlled an area of land all the way to the Danube in Europe, and also significantly far also into the east as well. And so the Persians were a massive, expansive empire. And they even defeated the Babylonians. They captured Babylon in the 6th century. That was the Achaemenid Persian king Cyrus. And, it's really kind of interesting when we talk about these Persian rulers. There's a term that we've used here called Achaemenid, and what this refers to specifically is to an ancient, historical, mythical king named Achaemenes. And Cyrus specifically traced his lineage back to Achaemenes. And Cyrus's following line, so Cyrus and then later Darius and Xerxes and other famous men from this particular family also are referred to as this Achaemenid dynasty. So we also will be talking about these guys in relationship with the ancient Greeks. Of course, it was the Greeks who managed to put up a successful resistance against the Persians. We talk about the Battle of Marathon, of course, as being a seminal point in that event, and we'll be talking about how that military victory for the Greeks later has a significant impact on Greek art, which we'll see particularly when we look at the Parthenon and when we talk about the sculptural decoration and the themes and really the meaning behind that particular example. So, and again, and that happens later. It's during the 5th century, and eventually, of course, Alexander the Great defeats the Persians, and the site that we're going to be primarily looking at today of Persepolis is mostly a ruin. It's really largely destroyed, and this is because it was in fact sacked and deliberately destroyed by Alexander the Great. So, and this is also the end, by the way, of the Achaemenid line. The last of the Persian leaders, really, from this line was slain by Alexander, and his name was Darius. And Darius, actually, it's interesting, Alexander actually gave him quite an elaborate burial and tomb, and this was probably a very deliberate and intentional political move. One of the things that's kind of interesting about the Persians in terms of, they conquered all of these different regions. They managed to defeat, again, the ancient Egyptians. They defeated the Babylonians and other groups as well, but rather than imposing their culture, their language, their forms of administration over these groups, they conquered them, but then allowed them to kind of continue and allow them to continue using their original bureaucratic forms, to use the same written languages they were familiar with. So, for example, in Egypt, hieroglyphic text was acceptable under the Persian rulers. Worship of a variety of different religions was acceptable. So in some ways, they were actually really quite permissive with their conquered territories when you look at it in that manner. Here we're looking at basically an aerial view of the ruins of Persepolis. So this particular site that we're looking at here was begun by Darius I in 518 BC. And the style is really very, very eclectic. It's one thing that's so interesting about this site, about Persepolis. When we look at the architecture, at the design, Persian architecture is really unusual. It certainly has some elements that are very unique and very distinctly Persian, but it really dramatically shows this blend from all of these different cultures, particularly that the Persians defeated. We see an incredible influence from the ancient Assyrians, from the Greeks, Ionian Greeks, particularly from the Ionian coast, and also from the Egyptians. We can see this in terms of the layout and the format of the structures themselves. We have kind of a standardized hypostyle hall, if you will, in particular with the forms we're looking at here. The largest form you can see kind of back in the distance a little bit back there that still has some remaining columns, which are mammoth columns, by the way, is called the Apadana, which was a massive audience hall. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail here when we look at some of these examples. So as I mentioned previously, when we talk about Achaemenid Persian art, one of the things that's interesting, particularly visible in their architecture, and you'll see here in some sculptural forms as well, is that they were heavily influenced by the other cultures that surrounded them, and again also by the different cultures that they managed to defeat, these other groups that became essentially dependent states upon the Persians. And so what we're looking at here is an example of a form that we have seen previously. We've talked about these guys when we looked at the ancient Near East specifically, and also particularly when we're talking about the ancient Assyrians. And so we may remember that with, for example, the citadel of Sargon or some of the other forms that we've seen, we would often find these massive winged human composite creatures mixed with a lion or a bull, which would form a phalanx, a guard at the entrance to some of these important locations. And these were called Lamassu, or Lamassai if we're talking about plural. So what we're looking at here is an example of a Lamassu, and it's clearly inspired by the ancient Assyrians. The entrance that we're looking at here to Persepolis led through a gate that was called the Gate of All Lands, and it was intended specifically to refer to the vast conquered spaces, really, of the Persian Empire. And again, here we can see clearly these Assyrian Lamassu. In the background, we can also see one of the columns of the Apadana, and we'll be talking about those a little bit more when we look at some other examples. Here's another image looking at the site of Persepolis. And here, if we look carefully, we can again see that this was at one point in time a hypostyle hall. So the influence that we can see on these structures comes from a variety of sources. We can clearly see the Egyptian influence, and also when we look at the columns themselves, in many cases we can see some influences from the ancient Greeks. And when we look at sculpture and other elements from these sites, we're going to see a variety of different cultural influences that had a clear impact on the ancient Persians. So here we're going to look at a few images from Persepolis, including some images that will show us a couple of different perspectives of probably the most important building on the site, the Apadana. Here we can see some of the lower buildings on the left, and on the right-hand side, a few of the columns that are still standing here from the Apadana. So this is a much better image, really, and shows us the frontal view here, really, of this great audience hall. We can see the stairway here, which would lead up onto the major platform. This was a really tremendously enormous structure. It would have been really something to be inside of this thing back in the time when it was in its original condition. To give you an idea of the proportions here, it was 60 feet high. So think of a 6-story building, 217 feet square, and this included 36 columns. Now, you can only here, again, just see these fragments of columns, and while the shaft in several of these is really relatively intact, the capitals are not. And the capitals were really amazing, massive, complex things, which included volutes, which were probably quite clearly inspired really by the ancient Greeks, as well as these unusual forms in the very, very top, which are made to resemble bulls, crouching bulls. And we'll look at one of those capitals a little bit later here in detail. But the scale of this structure is really pretty imposing. It's large enough that it could have held thousands of people, literally, in the interior. And the exterior, as you can make out here, is carved with beautiful relief images. We'll look at some examples of these also in a little greater detail. Another view here of the Apadana. This is actually one of your key artworks that you're responsible for recognizing, of course, as well. And here you can see it from a little greater distance and see how many columns survive. Again, the ones that remain are would have been part of a group of 36 of these original columns. And it would have been really pretty tremendous, I think, to see this back in its original heyday. The structure, as I mentioned previously as well, was largely destroyed by Alexander the Great. He did this as a very deliberate and intentional way to basically show that he had broken Persian power and defeated the Achaemenid line. So earlier I mentioned that the columns from the Apadana are no longer really complete or intact. We have the shaft which survives, but the capitals themselves are no longer in place. And what we're looking at here is actually an image from the Louvre in Paris. And this is a kind of repaired and patched back together, if you will, version of one of these examples. You can see some darker areas where it's been mortared and repaired and put back together again. It was shattered and then restored to the condition that you see. But what you're looking at here would have been the top part of one of those massive columns. So we have this form of volutes or scrolls in the base, which are really quite reminiscent of the Greek Ionic order. But what's really unusual is these images of crouching bulls that rest on the very top of that and support what would have been the entablature. They would have carried essentially an architrave over the top of the building. And these are enormous figures. These kneeling bulls are about as tall as a man, so that gives you some idea of their sheer scale. This is an image of the staircase, the side of the staircase that led up on top of the Apadana. And if you look carefully, you can see some images that may look a little bit familiar to you. For example, you can see a lion engaged in combat there fighting, and it's pretty clear when you look at that lion that it is based quite closely on earlier Assyrian models. And again, as we've kind of discussed here, the sculptural style, the technique that we see applied here is very eclectic. One of the reasons for this, by the way, is not just because the Persians were influenced by all these different groups of people and cultures that they conquered, but because the people who built this site, the workers, the laborers who actually created this Apadana and other structures here at Persepolis were in fact people who had been captured, who had been taken by the Persians, by Persian conquest, and then brought to the location where they created this work. So it's not accidental that we see such dramatic references to the styles of conquered cultures in this way. The walls around the Apadana include a series of different scenes. They have a procession of royal guards, Persian nobles and dignitaries, and it's also kind of interesting. We actually see representatives from 23 different subject nations, different countries really, that the Persians had conquered, and each of them is bringing tribute to the Persian king. And we can actually identify who these different individuals represent because each one wears their national costume and bears a typical regional gift, which is really pretty amazing and really quite informative. These would have been brightly painted when they were originally created. Of course, as you can see today, the paint no longer really survives. There are still examples of glazed brickwork that do survive from the period and give us a solid idea of what these would have looked like as well. Most of these structures, by the way, would not have been made of stone. They would have been largely baked mud brick. But of course we do have columns and other elements and the staircases and that sort of thing here, which would have been stone and are still somewhat more preserved. So another example here of one of these processional friezes from the Apadana. And in this particular detail, we may also again notice some relative similarities to other earlier styles and techniques. Again, in particular, I think the Assyrian style is probably the closest to what we see here, but it's much deeper in relief. These figures are much more rounded than we would expect to see in Assyrian art. They project more from the background. And the treatment of the drapery here certainly shows reference to the archaic Greeks as well. But the people who built this was actually built by a very diverse workforce, including Ionian Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, and also Babylonians.